The rain started just south of Hanover County, not the lazy kind that misted windshields and made people drive 5 under the limit, but the heavy Virginia downpour that turned two-lane roads into rivers and made a man question every decision that had brought him to this particular stretch of highway at this particular hour. Caleb Mercer kept both hands on the wheel of his pickup, a 2004 Ford F-150 with 230,000 miles on the odometer, and a passenger door that required a specific sequence of shoulder pressure and handle jiggling to open from the outside. The wipers slapped back and forth on a rhythm that had nothing to do with the rain's intensity, the left one dragging a quarter second behind the right, because the linkage bushing had worn out 6 months ago, and he kept telling himself he would fix it on a Sunday when there was nothing else to fix, which was a Sunday that never came. His tool bag sat in the passenger seat instead of a passenger. Socket wrenches, a torque wrench he had recalibrated by hand because the factory calibration drifted after 10,000 uses, a hydraulic jack that weighed 42 pounds and left a permanent dent in whatever surface he set it on, and a pressure gauge held together with electrical tape that he trusted more than any digital unit sold at the auto parts store on Route 1. The tape was not laziness. The gauge had been with him longer than most things in his life, longer than the truck, longer than the house, longer than the emptiness on the left side of the bed where Jenny used to sleep. He had wrapped it the first time in a forward operating base when sand got into the housing, and every layer since then was a year he kept going. The dashboard clock read 6:47. He had promised Sophie he would be home before dinner, which in their household meant before 7, which meant he was going to break that promise by at least 30 minutes, depending on traffic through Ashland. The thought sat in his chest like a stone he had swallowed and could not cough up. 9 years old, and she already knew the difference between his promises and his intentions, which was the distance between what a man wanted to do and what the world allowed him to do. He had wanted to leave the Henderson farm by 4. The transmission job on the old International Harvester ran long because the synchro rings were shot, and Henderson did not want to pay for new ones. So Caleb improvised with shims and patience, and 2 hours he did not have. Before that, there was the brake job on Mrs. Pemberton's Buick, a car so old it qualified for historical plates, driven by a woman so old she remembered when the car was new. She paid in small bills, counted out from an envelope she kept in her purse, and she was $6 short, and she apologized 3 times. Caleb told her the total was $6 less than it actually was, because watching a 78-year-old woman apologize for being poor was not something his stomach could handle on a Tuesday afternoon. She had asked him if the car would run safely, and he had told her what he told everyone, the words that came out before he could think about them, because they were the only standard he knew how to work by. He would put his own daughter in that car. That was the standard, not manufacturer specifications, not industry benchmarks, not whatever the dealership service department considered acceptable. His daughter, in that car, on that road, at any speed. The $6 came out of the Henderson job, which was already thin because Henderson haggled like a man who believed mechanics were trying to rob him rather than keep his equipment running. Caleb did not argue. He needed every job because Sophie's health insurance premium was due on the 15th, and the 15th was 9 days away, and he was $412 short. He knew the number exactly. He carried it the way some men carry their blood pressure numbers or their credit scores, a figure that defined the distance between stability and disaster. $412. 3 more jobs, at least, maybe 4 if the customers haggled the way Henderson did. He reached for his phone at the next red light in Ashland. 2 missed calls from home. No voicemails because Sophie had learned from experience that leaving a voicemail did not make her father arrive faster. He dialed back and she picked up on the second ring. Her voice carried that particular tone children develop when they have practiced not sounding worried. "You coming home soon?" Caleb's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I'm trying, sweetheart. Got one more thing to wrap up." It was not exactly a lie. He did not have one more thing. He had zero more things. He just was not close enough to home to make the promise true. And he had learned from 3 years of single parenthood that children parse language with the precision of contract lawyers. Sophie did not respond for a moment, and in that silence, Caleb heard something in the background, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the television playing low in the living room, the ambient sounds of a house holding its breath. Then she spoke. Mrs. Adler made mac and cheese. Sophie finally offered, which was her way of saying the neighbor was there, the food was handled, and the only missing variable was him. Save me some. There's a lot. He almost smiled. Then the light turned green and the truck behind him honked because 3 seconds of stillness at a green light was apparently a capital offense in Hanover County, Virginia. He heard Mrs. Adler's voice in the background muffled, directed at Sophie. Then Sophie came back. Mrs. Adler says, don't worry, but she also says, I've been watching the clock. The stone in his chest grew heavier. Tell her I'll be there. She knows. Sophie paused again. I know too. The call ended with a click that felt louder than it should have. He set the phone face down on the tool bag and drove into the rain, which was getting worse. The highway south of Ashland narrowed from 4 lanes to 2 as it crossed into the rural stretch between the suburbs and the next cluster of development. Streetlights disappeared. The shoulder became gravel, then dirt, then nothing. Caleb knew this road the way he knew the underside of an engine block, every crack and dip, memorized through repetition. He had driven it 6 days a week for 3 years, chasing work wherever it appeared, saying yes to every phone call because saying no meant Sophie's insurance or Sophie's school supplies or the electric bill or the mortgage that was technically Jenny's parents' money that he was paying back at a rate that would take him until he was 63. He was 48 years old. His knees ached from 12 years of kneeling on concrete and sand and gravel and mud. His lower back had a permanent complaint that he managed with ibuprofen and stubbornness. His hands were calloused in patterns that told the story of every tool he had ever held: the socket wrench callus on the right palm, the screwdriver ridge on the left index finger, the burn scar on the back of his wrist from a radiator hose that blew in July 4 years ago, 3 weeks after Jenny's funeral, when he went back to work too soon because grief did not pay bills. He did not feel sorry for himself. That was not something he did. Self-pity required a kind of stillness. He could not afford a moment to sit and measure the gap between what life was and what it should have been. He had measured that gap once in the weeks after Jenny died, sitting in the dark kitchen at 2 in the morning while Sophie slept down the hall, and the measurement nearly swallowed him. So he stopped measuring. He got up. He picked up the wrench. He answered the phone. He drove to the next job. The rain intensified as he passed the Mechanicsville exit sheets of water crashing against the windshield, hard enough to blur the road into a gray smear of reflected headlights. He slowed to 45, then 40, watching the shoulder for the familiar landmarks that told him he was 22 minutes from home. The dead oak tree at mile marker 41, the abandoned gas station with a collapsed canopy, the drainage culvert that flooded every time it rained this hard, sending a tongue of brown water across the right lane that could hydroplane a car if the driver was not paying attention. He saw the hazard lights first. Amber pulses cutting through the rain about a quarter-mile ahead, blinking on the right shoulder with the steady rhythm of a vehicle that had stopped but had not been turned off. As he got closer, the shape materialized through the downpour. A black SUV, large and angular, the kind that cost more than his house and his truck combined. Its right rear tire was shredded, the rubber peeled back from the rim like a failed experiment. The vehicle sat slightly tilted, its weight shifted onto the damaged corner. And standing beside it, one heel sinking into the gravel shoulder, was a woman in a charcoal coat that had no business being on the side of a service road in a rainstorm. She held a phone in one hand, gripping it so tightly that even from 50 yards away through rain and failing light, he could see the tension in her knuckles. Her other hand was crossed over her chest, holding the coat closed against the wind. Caleb eased the truck to the shoulder behind the SUV and put it in park. The engine idled roughly the way it always did when the humidity got into the intake. He sat for a moment watching the woman through his windshield. She had noticed his headlights and turned slightly, her posture shifting from frustration to wariness. Not scared, calculating, measuring risk the way people measured risk when they lived in a world where strangers on dark roads were problems, not solutions. He thought about Sophie, about the clock, about the mac and cheese getting cold. Then he thought about Sophie on the side of the road in the rain 15 years from now and whether he would want someone to drive past. He grabbed the jack and the socket set, pulled the hood of his canvas jacket up, and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit him immediately cold and hard, soaking through the canvas within 30 seconds. He walked toward the SUV with the jack balanced on his shoulder, each step crunching on wet gravel. The woman watched him approach with an expression that combined suspicion and impatience in equal measure, the look of someone who was accustomed to problems being solved before she had to think about them, and who was deeply irritated that this particular problem had not followed protocol. Up close, everything about her confirmed what the SUV already suggested. The coat was not department store charcoal. It was the kind of fabric that did not have a price tag because the people who wore it did not need to check. Her shoes were wrong for the situation in a way that meant she had not planned to be outside a climate-controlled vehicle tonight. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a way that was meant to look effortless, but probably took 20 minutes in a team. She looked at him the way she probably looked at contractors who showed up late, evaluating, categorizing, filing him in a mental folder labeled inconvenient. Her voice cut through the rain before he had set down the jack. "Are you done fixing that tire, or are you planning to rob me after?" Caleb set the jack on the wet pavement beside the shredded tire. He did not look up at her. He did not bristle. He did not match her tone, because matching someone's hostility was a luxury reserved for people who had the time and energy for it, and he had neither. Instead, he crouched beside the wheel and began assessing the damage with the practiced efficiency of a man who had changed more tires than he could count, in worse places than this, under circumstances that made a Virginia rainstorm feel like a mild inconvenience. The lug nuts were tight, factory torque, which meant no one had removed this wheel recently. The rim was undamaged beneath the shredded rubber. He pulled the spare from the cargo area beneath the rear hatch, noting that it was a full-size spare rather than the temporary donuts most manufacturers supplied, which told him this vehicle was equipped for people who could not afford to slow down, even when something went wrong. He worked without speaking for several minutes, loosening the lug nuts in a star pattern, positioning the jack at the reinforced contact point on the frame rail, pumping the handle with the steady rhythm that 12 years of this kind of work had carved into his muscle memory. The rain ran down the back of his neck and collected in the collar of his jacket, cold enough to make his shoulders tense, but not cold enough to slow his hands. The woman paced behind him, her heels clicking irregularly on the gravel. She was on the phone, intermittently speaking in a low voice that the rain and the passing traffic mostly swallowed. He caught fragments, words like schedule and unacceptable, and tell them I will be there, spoken with the kind of authority that did not request compliance but assumed it. He pulled the damaged tire off the hub and set it face down on the shoulder. That was when the first thing bothered him. Not the blowout itself, because tires failed, and that was the nature of rubber and road and speed and time, but the pattern of the failure. The tear along the sidewall was too clean. Road debris ripped jagged, pulling rubber in unpredictable directions, the way a wound bled in irregular patterns. This tear had a uniformity to it, a straightness along the inner edge that looked less like catastrophic failure and more like assisted weakness. He ran his thumb along the inside of the sidewall, feeling rather than seeing. There were score marks, shallow but deliberate, the kind a utility knife would leave if someone drew it along the inner rubber at a specific angle designed to compromise the structural integrity without being visible from the outside. The tire would hold at low speeds. It would hold in a parking lot. It might even hold for 20 minutes on the highway. But at sustained speed, with the centrifugal force pulling the rubber outward and the road surface hammering the contact patch thousands of times per minute, Those score marks would open like a zipper. Caleb's hand stopped moving. The rain continued. Traffic blurred past 10 feet away, each vehicle trailing a sheet of spray that temporarily blinded anyone standing on the shoulder. He stayed crouched beside the hub, his eyes moving from the damaged tire to the brake assembly behind it. The brake line was a thin black tube running from the caliper up through the wheel well toward the master cylinder. It should have been uniformly dull-coated in road grime and brake dust and the general filth that accumulated on the underside of any vehicle driven on public roads. But there was a spot about 3 inches behind the rotor where the line was clean. Not clean like new, clean like wiped. Someone had touched it recently enough that the rain had not yet restored the surrounding layer of grime. His stomach tightened. Not with fear, because fear was a thing that happened to people who had not spent years training themselves to convert it into attention. What tightened was something older, something he had worked very hard to bury beneath school schedules and oil changes and the ordinary rhythm of a civilian life he had chosen because the alternative meant missing his daughter's childhood. The instinct was simple, and it was loud, and it had not dimmed with years of disuse the way he had hoped it would. Something was wrong with this vehicle, and it was not the tire. He finished mounting the spare anyway, tightening the lug nuts in the same star pattern, lowering the jack slowly to let the suspension settle under the vehicle's weight. The woman had stopped pacing. She was watching him now with a different quality of attention, less impatient, more uncertain, as though the length of time he had spent crouched beside her wheel had shifted something in her calculation. He tightened the final lug nut, set the wrench on the wet pavement, and stood slowly. Rain slid off the hood of his canvas jacket. He was taller than she had expected. She could see that in the slight adjustment of her chin, the upward recalibration that happened when a person you had categorized as smaller than you turned out not to be. He was about to speak when the headlights appeared behind them. Not one set, 3, arriving in rapid succession, swinging onto the shoulder with the coordinated precision of vehicles that had practiced this maneuver many times. Brakes engaged almost simultaneously. Doors opened before the engines had fully settled. Men stepped out into the rain with the controlled urgency of professionals trained to treat every unknown as a threat until proven otherwise. The woman's posture changed instantly. Not relaxed, not relieved, recognized. The way a person's body shifted when the cavalry arrived, not because the danger was over, but because the responsibility for assessing it had transferred to someone else. The lead man was tall, mid-50s, with the build of someone who had been formidable in his 30s and had maintained enough of it through discipline to remain formidable now. He wore a dark suit that was already darkening further in the rain, and he moved toward Caleb with the directional certainty of a compass needle. His eyes went to the tire iron on the pavement, then to Caleb's boots, then to his hands, then to his face. The expression Caleb saw there was one he recognized from a lifetime of encounters with people who divided the world into categories based on appearance. The man saw grease-stained boots, a worn canvas jacket, calloused hands, in a pickup truck with rust on the wheel wells. He filed Caleb in the same mental folder the woman had used, except his folder had a different label. Not inconvenient, potentially dangerous. Step back from the vehicle. The man's voice was flat and final. Now. Caleb raised both hands slightly, palms open, the universal gesture of a man who has nothing to hide and no energy to prove it. Tires changed, jack still under load. You move it too fast, you'll shift the balance and drop the frame on the rotor. I said, step back. He took one step. No more. The rain tapped against the metal rim behind him and hissed on the hot hood of one of the newly arrived SUVs. 2 more men had positioned themselves at the angles that covered the road in both directions. A third was scanning the tree line with a flashlight, its beam cutting white streaks through the falling rain. The woman opened her mouth as if to explain the situation, then closed it when a second guard reached her side and placed himself between her and Caleb with the practiced ease of a man whose entire professional existence was built around being a wall between his principal and the world. Caleb watched all of this with the quiet patience of someone who had seen security protocols executed in places far more dangerous than a Virginia highway shoulder. These men were good. Their positioning was textbook. Their response times suggested they had been close, probably running a parallel route that allowed them to reach her within minutes of a location ping. But they had not been with her when the tire blew, which meant there had been a gap, a window, a stretch of time and road where the woman in the expensive coat had been alone in a vehicle that someone had very deliberately compromised. The lead man studied him. Caleb could feel the assessment happening, the rapid sorting of data points that experienced security professionals performed automatically, cross-referencing appearance with behavior, with context, with threat level. What the man saw did not compute cleanly. The clothes said laborer. The posture said something else. The calm said something else entirely. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The man addressed the woman without taking his eyes off Caleb. "I'm fine, Garrett." He was changing the tire. Garrett, a first name delivered with the ease of long familiarity. This was not a hired car service. This was a personal security detail. And the woman was not just wealthy. She was the kind of wealthy that required armed professionals to shadow her movements on a Tuesday night. Garrett's gaze dropped to the damaged tire lying face down on the shoulder. Then it came back to Caleb with a quality of suspicion that had sharpened rather than softened. A stranger alone on a dark road crouched beside a vehicle that belonged to someone important enough to warrant this response. In Garrett's world, that configuration had a name, and the name was not Good Samaritan. "Who called you?" Garrett asked. Caleb shook his head once. "Nobody. I was driving home. Saw the hazard lights. And you just stopped." Tire was flat. She was standing in the rain. Garrett processed this. The rain intensified around them, drumming against the convoy vehicles and turning the shoulder into a shallow stream that ran around their feet toward the drainage ditch. Two more guards had taken positions near the woman, one holding an umbrella he had produced from one of the SUVs, the other speaking quietly into a radio clipped near his collar. Caleb stood still. He had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to escalate a tense situation was to move when people with weapons expected you to be still. So he was still. The rain ran down his face and he did not wipe it. His hands remained visible and he did not lower them. His breathing was even and he did not try to explain himself further because over-explaining was what nervous people did. And nervousness in this context would be interpreted as guilt. But his eyes moved, not to the guards, not to the woman, to the wheel he had just finished. The damaged tire lay on its side in the rain tread. Up and from this angle, the score marks on the inner sidewall were visible as faint lines that could be mistaken for normal wear if you did not know what controlled degradation looked like. The brake line behind the rotor assembly still had that clean spot, that wipe section, where someone's fingers or a rag had disturbed the accumulated grime. He had been planning to mention it once the situation calmed down. Flat tire, dark road, frightened woman passing traffic. The right moment to say your vehicle may have been tampered with had not arrived before the convoy did. Now the convoy was here, and the security team was treating a roadside tire change like a potential attack, and the quiet mechanic standing in the rain was the only person on that shoulder who understood that they were right to be alarmed but wrong about the source. The woman Diana stepped out from behind her guard and closer to the space between Caleb and Garrett. The rain had darkened her coat to near black and flattened her hair against her temples, and she looked less like a corporate portrait and more like a person caught between two realities that did not fit together. The reality where a stranger helped her, and the reality where strangers were not to be trusted. He changed the tire, Garrett. That's all. Garrett did not respond to her directly. His attention remained fixed on Caleb in the way that large dogs watched unfamiliar visitors, not aggressive yet, but fully prepared to become so. The silence stretched. A truck roared past on the highway close enough that its wake sprayed water across all of them, and nobody flinched because flinching was an admission of something none of them were willing to admit. Caleb broke the silence himself, not because he was uncomfortable with it, but because the thing he had noticed could not wait for comfort. You might want to look at that tire before anyone drives this vehicle. Garrett's eyes narrowed. The tire you just changed. The one that blew. What about it? Caleb looked at the damaged tire, then back at Garrett. The failure pattern is wrong. Garrett's expression shifted not to belief, but to the particular kind of irritation that professionals feel when amateurs offer opinions in their field of expertise. Except this was not Garrett's field. Garrett's field was threat assessment, protective details, perimeter security. The mechanical condition of a tire was a maintenance issue, a logistics concern, something handled by mechanics and fleet managers and people who kneeled on wet pavement for a living. People like Caleb. Wrong how about? The question was reluctant, pulled out by the mechanics, calm certainty rather than by any actual interest in the answer. Caleb crouched beside the damaged tire despite the warning in Garrett's posture. He did not touch it. He pointed. See the tear along the sidewall? Road debris does that jagged. Rocks, metal, whatever they punch through at random angles. This tear is too straight, too uniform along the inner edge. Garrett glanced down. Rain streaked across the rubber surface, making it difficult to see detail. Tires fail. That's what they do. They do, but not like this. Caleb moved his finger along the air above the tire's inner surface, tracing the faint score marks without making contact. Those lines are too regular. Someone weakened the sidewall before it ever hit the road. The silence that followed was different from the one before. The first silence had been about authority and compliance, a security chief asserting control over an unknown variable. This silence was about something much more uncomfortable. The possibility that the unknown variable was the only person present who understood what he was looking at. The woman stepped closer. Her coat was soaked through now, the fabric clinging to her shoulders, and she did not seem to notice. What exactly are you saying? Caleb stood slowly. The calm in him had changed shape, and anyone who was paying attention could see it. The patience of a mechanic doing roadside work had been replaced by something more focused, more controlled, the attention of a man who had spent years reading damage patterns the way other people read sentences, quickly, accurately, and with an understanding of what the words meant when you put them together. I'm saying the tire wasn't the real problem. Garrett's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to civilians making statements with that kind of authority about matters adjacent to his responsibilities. The space between professional pride and professional caution narrowed, and for a moment it could have gone either way, dismissal or investigation. The woman made the decision for both of them. Her voice carried a quality that had nothing to do with the sharp tone she had used earlier, the one designed to keep a stranger at a distance. This was the voice of someone who made decisions that affected hundreds of people daily and who had learned to recognize the sound of competence, even when it arrived in stained boots and a wet canvas jacket. Show me. Caleb crouched again beside the wheel well, careful not to touch anything now because the nature of the situation had changed and contact meant contamination. He pointed toward the thin black brake line tucked behind the rotor assembly. See that section right there, about 3 inches behind the caliper? Garrett moved closer despite himself drawn by the same instinct that pulled experienced investigators towards evidence, even when they distrusted the person presenting it. He crouched beside Caleb, their shoulders nearly touching two men of roughly similar age and vastly different circumstances, staring at the same small section of brake line in the rain. The shine, Caleb continued quietly. Rain would coat the whole line evenly. Dust, brake, residue, road grime, it builds up the same everywhere. But that spot is clean. Someone wiped it. Recently. Garrett stared at the line for a long moment. The rain tapped steadily against the underside of the vehicle above them, a metallic percussion that filled the silence. That could be anything. Mechanic at the last service touched it. Road splash hit it at the right angle. Could be. Caleb's voice remained even. But then there's the scoring on the sidewall. He reached toward the damaged tire and again stopped short of touching it, tracing the air above the inner edge where the faint lines ran parallel to the bead. Those cuts are too uniform. A blowout from road debris tears random. This was weakened first, methodically. Garrett studied the marks. His training was not in vehicle mechanics, but it was in patterns and recognizing when something did not fit the profile of accident or coincidence. The marks were there, faint, almost invisible under the coating of rain and road grime, but present, regular, intentional. He stood slowly. Rain ran off the brim of his collar. His expression had undergone a transformation that Caleb recognized because he had seen it before in other men, in other places, the moment when professional skepticism collided with physical evidence and lost. Garrett turned to his team. Full inspection, engine compartment, undercarriage electronics, everything. Two guards moved immediately, dropping to the wet pavement and sliding under the SUV with portable lights. Another opened the hood. The quiet highway shoulder transformed into something closer to a crime scene, the systematic examination of a vehicle that 10 minutes ago had been nothing more than a flat tire on a dark road. Caleb stepped back to give them room. He was wet to the skin now, the canvas jacket having surrendered any pretense of water resistance sometime in the last 20 minutes. His jeans were heavy with rain. His boots squelched on the gravel. He stood beside his own truck and watched the security team work, and he felt the old machinery in his mind turning over for the first time in years, the analytical engine that had been designed to do exactly this, to look at a vehicle and see not what was wrong, but what had been done to it. The woman approached him. Without the shelter of the SUV door and without the defensive posture of their first encounter, she looked different. Smaller in some way that had nothing to do with height. The coat that had projected authority now just looked wet. Her eyes, which had been sharp with suspicion, were quieter now, working through something internal that Caleb could not read, but could recognize. She was recalculating. Not him. Everything. You noticed this while you were changing the tire. It was not a question. Part of it. And you didn't say anything. Caleb met her eyes. You were in a hurry, I wasn't sure yet. And telling a stranger on the side of the road that their car might have been tampered with is the kind of thing you want to be right about before you say it. She absorbed this. Across the shoulder, one of the guards slid out from beneath the SUV, rain and mud streaking his suit. He was holding something small between his thumb and forefinger, a thin wedge of metal sharpened on one side. Garrett took it and examined it under the beam of a flashlight. His expression hardened into something that left no room for alternative explanations. Caleb could see it from 10 feet away, the shape of it, the engineered precision. A spike insert designed to lodge near the suspension and finish tearing a tire after an initial weakening had started the process. Not a random piece of road debris, a tool. Garrett looked at the woman, then at Caleb, then back at the piece of metal in his hand. Where did you find this? He asked the guard, wedged near the right rear control arm, not visible without removing the wheel. Garrett held the spike insert up so the flashlight caught its edge. The sharpened side gleamed. Caleb watched him process the same sequence of conclusions he had already reached, but slower because Garrett was arriving at them through evidence rather than instinct, and evidence required each step to be confirmed before the next one could begin. This was placed there, Garrett said. Not a question. Caleb nodded once. Designed to finish what the scoring on the sidewall started. Weaken the tire first, then the insert works its way deeper under road vibration until the sidewall gives out. The woman's voice dropped. At speed. Caleb looked at her. That's the point. Whoever did this didn't want the car to fail here. They wanted it to fail later. At highway speed, probably in a curve. Garrett's head turned toward the road ahead. The highway curved gently about half a mile south, bending left around a stand of trees that blocked visibility from either direction. At 70 miles per hour, a simultaneous tire failure and brake pressure loss in that curve would not result in a controlled stop. It would result in a barrier strike or worse, a rollover into the tree line. The convoy engines idled behind them, steady and deep. Traffic continued to pass in bursts of white headlights and spray. The rain showed no sign of stopping, and the quiet shoulder of a Virginia service road had become something much more dangerous than anyone except the mechanic had recognized. Garrett moved quickly now. No one drives that vehicle. No one touches it until forensics can process it. He turned to his team with commands that came out sharp and clean, the voice of a man who had served in agencies where ambiguity cost lives and who had no tolerance for it now. Guards shifted into new positions. Radios crackled with low voices, relaying instructions. The woman stood in the rain between the two vehicles, her disabled SUV and Garrett's convoy, and something in her face had gone very still. Not fear, not yet. Something before fear, the recognition that the world she moved through, the world of security details and armored vehicles in careful schedules, had failed in a way she had not anticipated. Someone had reached through all of it and placed a sharpened piece of metal next to her tire and cut her a brake line and then walked away and waited. She looked at Caleb with an expression he could not fully read, but that contained at least one element he recognized. It was the expression people wore when they realized that the most important person in a room was not the one they had expected. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. Caleb Mercer." "And you stopped because you saw a flat tire." "I stopped because I saw someone who needed help." She studied him. Grease-stained boots, canvas jacket dark with rain, hands that had never seen the inside of a corporate boardroom, but could read the underside of a vehicle the way a surgeon read an X-ray. Nothing about him fit the world she occupied, and everything about him had just proven more valuable than the entire apparatus she paid to keep her safe. Garrett returned and positioned himself between them, not protectively this time, but strategically triangulating between the person he was paid to guard and the person who had just done his job better than he had. The professional pride was still there, visible in the set of his jaw and the tension in his shoulders, but it was losing ground to something stronger. The evidence under the vehicle was not ambiguous. The mechanic had been right. "Mr. Mercer," Garrett's voice was careful now, the sharpness replaced by something more measured. "How exactly did you learn to spot something like this?" The question settled between them like a coin landing on its edge, balanced between the mechanic's present and whatever had come before it. Caleb felt the old life brush against the current one, the way a hand brushed against a hot surface, brief contact followed by the instinct to pull back. He looked at the highway stretching south into darkness. Headlights streaked past like tracer rounds there and gone. The rain drummed on every surface, metal and asphalt and canvas and skin. "I used to work around vehicles that people really wanted destroyed." Garrett stared at him. The woman stared at him. The guards who were close enough to hear stopped what they were doing and stared at him. The rain continued to fall, indifferent to the shift that had just occurred on the shoulder of a two-lane road in Virginia, where a mechanic who had stopped to change a tire had just revealed that the quiet competence they had witnessed was not talent or luck, but the residue of a life spent doing exactly this, reading vehicles for the signatures of intentional destruction in places far more dangerous than a rainy highway. And for the first time that night, every person on that dark stretch of road was listening to the man in the wet canvas jacket, truly listening. Because the single dad who had been driving home to his daughter, who was $412 short on insurance and 3 broken promises behind on dinner, had just become the most important person standing in the rain. The woman looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at the disabled SUV, then at the spike insert still in his hand, then at the brake line his team was now photographing with handheld lights. Then he looked at the quiet mechanic who had found all of it in under 3 minutes with nothing but a flashlight and a lifetime of practice. The rain fell harder. Somewhere across town, a 9-year-old girl sat in a kitchen watching a battery-operated clock mounted above the stove, a yard sale find her mother had brought home the summer before everything changed. The porch light was on, It would stay on until he walked through the door, however long that took, because that was what Sophie did when she was worried, and she was always worried, and she was always right to be. Caleb opened the worn tool bag in the bed of his pickup and pulled out the pressure clamp he carried for jobs that turned sideways. It was a simple piece of equipment, a C-shaped metal bracket with a tightening screw and a rubber gasket rated for hydraulic lines up to 3,000 psi. He had bought it 7 years ago from a surplus catalog and used it maybe 4 times always in situations where a brake job revealed something worse than worn pads. It was not impressive to look at. Neither was a tourniquet, and tourniquets saved lives. Garrett watched him carry it back toward the disabled SUV with the skepticism of a man whose entire career had been built around trusting systems and distrusting strangers. The rain had eased from downpour to steady fall, the kind that soaked everything without the drama of the heavier stuff, and the shoulder of the highway had taken on the silver-gray quality of wet pavement under artificial light. The convoy vehicles idled in formation behind them, their headlights creating overlapping cones of illumination that turned the work area into something resembling an operating theater, bright at the center and dark at the edges. Diana Ashford stood beside the rear passenger door of the nearest convoy vehicle, arms crossed, watching the mechanic approach her disabled SUV with a tool that looked like it belonged in a hardware store bargain bin. She had spent 15 years building a company that designed security systems sophisticated enough to protect military installations and corporate data centers across the country. The idea that the most critical repair of her evening was about to be performed with a clamp that cost less than her morning coffee created a dissonance she could feel in her teeth. Caleb crouched beside the wheel well and slid partially under the vehicle, his shoulders disappearing beneath the chassis. A guard instinctively dropped to one knee beside him with a flashlight angling the beam toward the brake assembly without being asked. The guard's face was unreadable, but his positioning said something his expression did not. He had shifted from monitoring a potential threat to assisting an operation. That transition had happened without instruction, which meant the evidence under the vehicle had done what Caleb's words alone could not. The underside of the SUV was a landscape of steel and aluminum and rubber cross members and control arms and exhaust components arranged in the precise geometry of German engineering. Caleb's eyes moved through it the way a reader's eyes moved through familiar text, not searching, but recognizing, cataloging each component's condition against the template of what it should look like. The brake line ran along the inner frame rail, secured by plastic clips at 12-inch intervals, a thin black artery carrying pressurized fluid from the master cylinder to the caliper. The cut was subtle, not a slash which would have caused immediate failure, but a partial incision, maybe 60% through the line's wall, positioned at a point where road vibration and thermal expansion would do the rest over miles and minutes. His fingers found the section by feel rather than sight, the slight irregularity in the line's surface where the blade had compressed the outer layer. He positioned the clamp on either side of the cut, tightened the screw until the rubber gasket compressed firmly against the line, then gave it an additional quarter turn. The metal hissed softly as the hydraulic pressure equalized against the new seal. Temporary, imperfect, but functional enough to move the vehicle at low speed without the progressive fluid loss that would have drained the system within a mile at highway pace. He slid out from beneath the vehicle. Rain and grease streaked at his face in patterns that made him look older than 48, or maybe just more honest about the years than most people managed. Garrett crouched beside him, inspecting the clamp with the focused attention of someone evaluating unfamiliar work in a high-stakes context. "Pressure looks stable," Garrett admitted, and the admission cost him something visible in the tightening of his jaw, because acknowledging the repair meant acknowledging that the mechanic kneeling in the rain had just done something his entire team could not. "Temporary. It'll hold long enough to move the vehicle slowly. Don't push it past 35 and don't brake hard." Diana stepped closer, her shoes dark with water, the hem of her coat heavy against her legs. "You did that in under 2 minutes. Caleb wiped his hands on the rag from his back pocket. The rag was already saturated, so the gesture was more habit than function. Where I learned this, there wasn't the luxury of a third minute. The words landed in a space that had grown quieter around them, the guards pausing in their tasks, Garrett straightening from his crouch. Nobody asked where. Not yet. But the shape of the question filled the silence the way water filled a crack, finding every gap and pressing against every edge. Diana looked at the clamp, at the tool bag, at the man who carried both. Simple tools for a complicated problem. Caleb zipped the bag. Tools don't matter as much as knowing where the problem is. Garrett rose to his full height. The rain had flattened his hair and darkened his suit to the color of wet slate, and in the harsh crosslight of the convoy headlamps, he looked like a man who had arrived at a conclusion he did not enjoy. "You're coming with us." Caleb glanced toward his pickup. The old truck sat alone on the shoulder headlights off tools scattered in the bed from the tire job. Inside the cab, face down on the tool bag, his phone held 2 missed calls and a conversation with a 9-year-old girl who was watching a clock. The weight of that pulled at him with a gravity that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with the particular obligation a single father carries. The knowledge that every hour away from home is an hour his daughter spends learning that the people who love her most are also the people who disappear most often. Garrett followed his gaze. "You have somewhere to be." "My daughter." 2 words. They filled the rain-soaked air between the two men with a specificity that career summaries and threat assessments could not match. My daughter, not my house, not my evening, not my plans. A person, small, waiting. Diana's expression shifted. Something behind the corporate composure moved, not dramatically, not in a way that someone who did not know loneliness would recognize, but perceptibly. The mechanic had someone counting minutes until he walked through a door. Diana had a security detail in a penthouse in an empire made of contracts and stock prices, and no one on earth was watching a clock for her. Caleb grabbed his tool bag and threw it into the back seat of the SUV. The gesture was not dramatic. It was resigned, the movement of a man who understood that the choice had already been made the moment he saw the scoring on that sidewall, and that everything since then had been the slow catching up of action to decision. He could not unknow what he knew. He could not unsee the blade marks and the wiped line and the sharpened insert. Driving home and eating cold mac and cheese while someone sent this woman back onto the highway in a vehicle designed to kill her was not something his hands would let him do, because his hands had been trained to fix things, and this was not fixed. Garrett opened the driver's door of the disabled SUV. Caleb slid into the passenger seat. Diana stepped into the rear. The convoy engines rumbled as the formation tightened around them, black vehicles closing ranks like a fist. Garrett started the engine, carefully listening. The brake pedal had pressure. The clamp held. They pulled onto the highway at 30 miles per hour, the convoy spreading around them in a protective diamond. The rain continued to fall lighter now, but persistent, and the road ahead stretched into darkness, cut only by headlights and the occasional amber pulse of highway reflectors. Caleb did not watch the convoy. He watched the road. The way the surface reflected light at different angles depending on what was on it. The way standing water gathered in depressions that telegraphed the road's drainage pattern. The way the tree line on both sides created quarters of shadow that could conceal anything from a parked vehicle to a person to nothing at all. He watched the road the way he had once watched roads in places where watching was the difference between arriving and not arriving. Diana leaned forward between the seats. "How long was the car parked before the tire blew?" "About 10 minutes. I stopped at a fuel station off Route 301 to take a call, stepped inside for privacy." A pause that contained something she had not yet said. "Confidential call, board meeting tomorrow." Caleb absorbed this. 10 minutes. Gas station, vehicle unattended. That was enough time for someone who knew what they were doing to score a sidewall, prep a brake line, and plan an insert. Not rushed, not sloppy, practiced. Garrett's hands were steady on the wheel, but his knuckles had gone pale. "The board meeting tomorrow, that's the prior vote." Diana did not respond immediately, which was itself a response. The air inside the vehicle changed the way air changes when a door opens in winter, a sudden influx of something colder. Russell Pryor, Diana finally confirmed, Chief Financial Officer. The board votes tomorrow on his termination. Suspected misappropriation of defense contract funds. I brought the motion. Caleb watched the road. If you're not there tomorrow, the vote doesn't happen. Garrett glanced at him in the peripheral darkness. That narrows the list. Caleb's voice was quiet. Desperate people don't choose allies. They choose tools. The word hung in the cabin like smoke. Tools. The spike insert was a tool. The scored sidewall was a tool. The 10-minute window at the gas station was a tool. And somewhere out there, the person who had wielded them was waiting to learn whether they had worked. The convoy moved through the rain at a pace that felt simultaneously too fast and too slow fast enough that the damaged vehicle's temporary repair was being tested with every mile slow enough that anyone watching from a distance would know something was wrong. Garrett spoke into his radio in clipped phrases, coordinating a route change, shifting the convoy south instead of taking the interstate. Less predictable, he explained. Fewer high-speed curves. Caleb noted that Garrett did not explain the other reason, which was that fewer high-speed curves meant fewer locations, where a brake failure at speed would guarantee fatality rather than injury. The security chief was thinking tactically now, which was good, but he was thinking defensively, which was incomplete. Defensive thinking assumed the threat was behind them. Caleb was not convinced it was. 11 minutes into the drive, Caleb's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, saw the number, and felt the stone in his chest double in mass. Hey, sweetheart. Sophie's voice was drowsy, but present. The voice of a child who had been trying to stay awake and was losing the battle. Where are you, Dad? He closed his eyes for half a second. The inside of the SUV smelled like leather and rain and the faint chemical scent of new electronics. Nothing like the truck cab that smelled like motor oil and the strawberry air freshener Sophie had hung from the mirror last Christmas. He was in the wrong vehicle, on the wrong road, heading in the wrong direction from his daughter. And the reason was a woman he did not know and a conscience he could not disable. Helping someone with a tow job. Got held up. I'll be home soon. Silence on the line. Then Sophie, with a directness that 9-year-olds wielded like a scalpel because they had not yet learned to soften truth with politeness. You're helping someone again, aren't you? You always do this. He wanted to say he would be home in an hour. He wanted to say the mac and cheese was worth reheating. He wanted to say the things father said when the gap between intention and reality was too wide to bridge with honesty. Instead, he said the only thing he could say that was not a lie. Go to sleep, Soph. When I get in, I'll come to your room. You said that last time. I waited until 11. The words cut through the engine noise and the rain and the quiet hum of the convoy vehicles like a blade through scored rubber. She was 9. She stayed up until 11 waiting for a father who did not come home when he said he would, and she was telling him this not as an accusation but as a fact, the way she might tell him the weather or what Mrs. Adler made for dinner. A fact of her life. Daddy says he'll come home. Daddy doesn't come when he says. The porch light stays on. He ended the call because if he stayed on the line another 10 seconds, his voice was going to do something he could not allow it to do in the back of a stranger's SUV with an audience of 2 people who had already seen more of him than he was comfortable with. Diana was quiet in the back seat. She had heard every word because the vehicle was not large enough to pretend otherwise. And the silence that followed was not the silence of someone who had not been listening, but the silence of someone who had recognized in the mechanic's conversation with his daughter something that resonated in a frequency she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. Nobody counted hours for Diane Ashford. Nobody left porch lights on. Her apartment in the city had motion sensor lighting that activated when she entered and deactivated when she left, efficient and automatic and entirely indifferent to whether she came home at all. She did not say anything, but in the glow of the dashboard instruments, Caleb caught her reflection in the side window, and her expression had shed several layers of the corporate architecture that normally covered it. What remained was not vulnerability exactly, it was recognition. The recognition that the man in the front seat, who could not afford his daughter's insurance premium, possessed something that could not be purchased with any amount of the money she had spent her life accumulating. Garrett broke the quiet. We need to talk about who had access to that vehicle today. Caleb redirected his attention to the road. She said 10 minutes at the gas station. That's the window. Pryor's office got her scheduled 2 days ago for the pre-board coordination meeting. Diana's voice from the back seat, flat and precise, which means he knew I'd be on Route 301 tonight. Knew the route, knew the timing. Caleb watched the tree line. Knowing the route means knowing the curves. Half a mile past where she stopped, the highway bends left around that tree stand. 70 miles an hour, no brakes, blown tire. That's not an accident, that's engineering. Garrett processed this. His driving had become tighter in the last few minutes. Smaller steering inputs, more frequent mirror checks. The unconscious compression of a man whose threat awareness had shifted from yellow to orange. Pryor's smart enough not to do this himself. Diana leaned forward again. He's smart enough to hire someone who knows our vehicles. That sentence opened a door that nobody in the vehicle wanted to walk through, because behind it was the implication that the person who had sabotaged the SUV was not a random contractor or a desperate amateur, but someone with specific knowledge of Ashford Defense Systems fleet, someone who knew where the brake lines ran and where the suspension components were accessible and how long a scored sidewall would hold before it gave way at speed. An insider, or a former insider. Caleb filed the implication without commenting on it. The convoy crossed a small bridge over a creek swollen with rainwater, the sound of rushing water briefly audible through the vehicle's insulated cabin. Ahead, the road dipped into a shallow valley where the tree line closed in from both sides, narrowing the horizon to a corridor of wet pavement and reflected light. Something changed in Caleb's posture. It was subtle, a slight forward lean, a narrowing of focus that Garrett noticed immediately because Garrett had spent 30 years reading body language for threat indicators. What? Caleb did not answer. He was staring at the road surface, 50 yards ahead, where the headlights of the lead convoy vehicle illuminated the pavement in a wide white cone. At first, there was nothing unusual, just wet asphalt reflecting light, the way wet asphalt always did, silver and gray, and streaked with the passing shadows of raindrops. Then the surface shifted, a sheen that was not water, a slickness that caught the light at a different angle, flatter, more uniform, spreading across both lanes, like a glass sheet laid on the road. Slow down, Garrett frowned. We're already at 30. Slower. Something in the mechanic's voice bypassed Garrett's professional resistance, entirely the way a fire alarm bypasses the decision to investigate and goes straight to the legs. He eased off the accelerator. 25, 20. What are we looking at? Diana leaned between the seats, her eyes following Caleb's gaze. Diesel, maybe hydraulic fluid, spread across both lanes right where the road curves. Garrett saw it now. The sheen stretched from shoulder to shoulder, maybe 30 yards of it, positioned precisely where a vehicle would begin to turn and where the laws of physics would punish any loss of traction with a slide toward the outside of the curve and the drainage ditch beyond it. That wasn't there this morning. I drove this route for the advance check. Caleb nodded. No, someone put it there tonight. Diana's voice dropped a register. Right where we'd slow down for the curve. Right where you'd speed up if you didn't know it was coming. Garrett's radio crackled. He spoke into it without taking his eyes off the road. Convoy hold formation. Road hazard ahead. Maintain current speed, no sudden braking. Repeat, no sudden braking. Acknowledgements came back in sequence from each vehicle. Caleb listened to them and felt the presence of the third guard's reaction, the one driving the vehicle behind them, the slight tightening of interval that meant the driver had seen the sheen too and was fighting the instinct to tap the brakes. "Keep it straight," Caleb told Garrett quietly. "No steering corrections. Let the tires find their grip. If we slide, do not counter-steer. Let the car go where it wants to go and correct after you're through." Garrett's hands settled on the wheel at 10 and 2, and for the first time in the evening, the security chief was taking direction from the mechanic without hesitation or qualification. The professional pride had not disappeared, but it had been overruled by something more fundamental than pride, which was the desire to keep the woman in the back seat alive. The SUV's front tires reached the edge of the slick patch. Caleb felt the change immediately, a loosening of the vehicle's connection to the road, the steering going light, in a way that made the 3-ton SUV feel suddenly weightless, as though the laws that govern mass and friction had been temporarily suspended. The sensation lasted 5 seconds that stretched to fill a much larger space in time. 5 seconds during which the vehicle glided across a surface that wanted to send it spinning into the ditch at the outside of the curve. Behind them, the convoy followed. The third vehicle, the one with the young driver, slid slightly left. Caleb heard the tires chirp through the open radio channel, and his voice cut through before Garrett could react. "Vehicle 3, release the brake. Light throttle. Hold the wheel straight." A pause. The chirping stopped. The vehicle stabilized. The SUV reached dry pavement. The steering firmed. Garrett exhaled through his nose, a controlled release that carried considerably more tension than he would ever admit to producing. "That's 2. Diesel on a blind curve" is page 1 of the convoy interdiction manual. Caleb's delivery was dry, the tone of someone referencing a textbook rather than describing a near-death experience. If the first trap doesn't disable the target vehicle, the road hazard catches whatever's left. Garrett's jaw worked silently. Diana sat back in her seat. Her arms were crossed over her chest in the posture of someone holding herself together rather than holding herself apart, and her eyes had the quality of a person performing rapid calculations with insufficient data, running scenarios, discarding the ones that did not fit, arriving at conclusions she did not want to reach. "Whoever planned this knew the route," she said, "knew the timing, knew the curve, and knew we'd be running this direction after the tire blew," Garrett added. Caleb watched the road beyond the curve. The tree line opened slightly, revealing a stretch of straight highway that led toward an intersection about a mile ahead. A blinking yellow traffic light swayed in the wind and rain, marking the junction where the service road met a smaller county road heading south. Their alternate route. "Let me ask something." Caleb's voice was even. "Who built the advance route for tonight?" Garrett glanced at him. "My team. Standard procedure." "And who reviewed it?" The silence was answer enough. The advance route would have been logged in the system, accessible to anyone in the security infrastructure who had clearance, which at a company like Ashford Defense Systems meant a very short list of very specific people. People who would also have access to the vehicle fleet specifications, the maintenance schedules, and the knowledge of which fuel station Diana preferred on Route 301. Diana said it before Garrett could. The route was filed through the Executive Operations Office. Russell Pryor has access to that system. The interior of the vehicle went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the climate control. Caleb absorbed the information without reaction. Because reaction required energy, he was directing elsewhere toward the road, toward the intersection ahead, toward the part of his mind that had spent 12 years studying the architecture of ambush and had never fully decommissioned that knowledge, despite his best efforts. Garrett's phone buzzed. He answered on speaker, one hand on the wheel. The voice on the other end belonged to someone at the office, speaking quickly, the cadence of a person delivering information that had just become urgent. The fuel station on Route 301 had security footage from a secondary camera that the station owner had forgotten existed, mounted on the side of the building facing the parking area. It had captured 15 minutes of activity during the window when Diana's SUV was unattended. A white cargo van had been parked across the lot, positioned in a blind spot from the primary cameras, but partially visible from the secondary angle. A figure had exited the van, approached Diana's vehicle on the passenger side, spent approximately 4 minutes beneath the right rear quarter, and returned to the van. The van had departed 3 minutes before Diana returned to her vehicle. No plate visible, no face visible, but the figure moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this before. Garrett ended the call. The rain drummed on the roof. The convoy moved through the darkness at 28 miles per hour, and the investigation that had started as a flat tire had become something with dimensions none of them could yet fully see. 4 minutes, Caleb said. That's not amateur. That's someone who knew exactly what to do and exactly how long it would take. Diana's voice was cold. Russell has access to our fleet vendor records. He would know who services the executive vehicles. Caleb looked at the road ahead. The intersection was getting closer, the yellow light pulsing against the rain like a slow heartbeat. Knowing the vendor isn't the same as knowing the vehicle. Whoever crawled under your car knew the brake line routing the suspension geometry, the exact spot to place that insert where it wouldn't be visible without removing the wheel. That's not something you'd get from a service record. That's hands-on knowledge. Garrett followed the logic to its destination. Someone who worked on the fleet directly, or someone who used to. Diana fell quiet. The implication was clear enough that nobody needed to build it further. Ashford Defense Systems employed hundreds of people, former employees numbered in the thousands. But the Venn diagram of people who had hands-on access to the executive vehicle fleet, who had reason to cooperate with Russell Pryor, and who possessed the mechanical skill to execute a three-stage sabotage plan in 4 minutes was not a large circle. It might be a single name. The intersection approached. Caleb had been watching it since the yellow light first became visible through the rain, tracking the geometry of the junction, the width of the lanes, the condition of the shoulders, the drainage patterns, the sight lines. It was an unremarkable crossroads by any normal standard, a two-lane service road meeting a two-lane county road under a blinking light. But Caleb had stopped looking at roads through normal standards about 40 minutes ago, and what he saw now made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A dark vehicle was parked just beyond the intersection on the far side of the county road. Engine running, headlights off, positioned at a slight angle, its nose pointed toward the road the convoy was about to turn onto. Garrett, I see it. The vehicle sat in the shadow of a power line pole, partially obscured by the overgrown brush at the roadside. It was not blocking the intersection. It was not directly in the path of travel. It was positioned just enough to force any vehicle turning left onto the county road to adjust its line slightly, to pull left of center to clear the parked car's nose, which would put the turning vehicle exactly on the section of shoulder where the rain had softened the ground of mud. Caleb's mind laid the geometry out in 3 dimensions. The parked car was not an obstacle. It was a funnel, a channeling device designed to direct the convoy's lead vehicle to soft ground at a point where the drainage ditch ran deep enough to catch a tire and pull it off the pavement. At 30 miles per hour, the lead SUV's weight would sink the right wheels into mud, pulling the vehicle into a yaw that the following vehicles could not avoid. A chain reaction, exactly the kind of multi-vehicle incident that would be impossible to distinguish from a weather-related accident. Don't take the turn. Garrett's hands tightened on the wheel. That's our route. Not anymore. Diana leaned forward. If we stop, they know we see them. Caleb was already scanning the margins of the intersection, looking for what he needed. The headlights caught a narrow gap between 2 trees on the far side of the junction, a maintenance access lane barely wide enough for a single vehicle, the kind of path utility companies use to reach power lines and drainage infrastructure. It was not a road. It was not on any map. But it was paved, or at least graveled, and it continued beyond the tree line toward what Caleb's mental map of the county told him was a reconnection with the main highway further south. Straight through, right there. He pointed toward the gap. Garrett saw it. That's barely a lane. It's enough. The parked vehicle's engine revved. The driver had been watching. The convoy's approach had been visible for the last 30 seconds. Headlights crawling through the rain, and the slow speed would have confirmed that the lead vehicle was damaged, which meant the earlier traps had partially worked, which meant the funnel was the final stage. Garrett did not hesitate further. Something in the last hour had built a bridge between the security chief and the mechanic that neither of them would have predicted at its beginning, a bridge made of brake lines and spike inserts, and the quiet competence of a man who saw what others missed. Garrett pressed the accelerator. The SUV surged forward not toward the left turn, but straight through the intersection and into the maintenance lane between the trees. The parked vehicle lurched forward, its driver reacting too late, swinging across the intersection to block a turn that was no longer happening. The convoy followed Garrett through the gap, one by one, headlights bouncing as the vehicles crossed from pavement to gravel. Branches scraped along both sides of the SUV, the sound like fingernails on a chalkboard, and Diana gripped the back of the front seat as the vehicle bounced over uneven ground. In the side mirror, Caleb caught a glimpse of the blocking car, skidding to a stop in the intersection, brake lights flaring red in the rain. And in the brief flash of the convoy's headlights sweeping across the vehicle, he saw the driver. A man mid-40s, expression not panicked, but calculating, adjusting. And on his wrist, illuminated for one fractional second before the light passed, a tattoo. A wrench. Simple. Black. The kind of mark a man chose when his identity and his trade were the same thing. Caleb memorized the image the way he had once memorized vehicle identification numbers and blast patterns. He filed it without comment. The information would matter later. Right now, what mattered was the narrow lane ahead and the 1,200 yards of gravel and tree canopy between the convoy and the highway. Garrett drove with focus that bordered on aggression, pushing the damaged SUV through turns that the maintenance lane had not been designed to handle. The clamp on the brake line held. The temporary repair that Caleb had made with a $40 tool and 2 minutes of work beneath a vehicle in the rain was now the only thing standing between a controlled drive and a catastrophic failure on a gravel road in the dark. The lane curved sharply right then left, then opened onto the main highway. Garrett merged without slowing, the SUV's tires barking once on the wet pavement before finding purchase. Behind them, the convoy vehicles followed in sequence, headlights sweeping through the trees and onto the road like searchlights. Caleb checked the mirrors. All vehicles intact. No pursuit. The blocking car had not followed them into the maintenance lane, which meant the driver had either given up or was taking another route to a different position. Caleb suspected the latter. Garrett's breathing was audible now, the controlled breathing of a man working to lower his heart rate through discipline rather than relaxation. That's 3. Diana sat back. Her arms were no longer crossed. Her hands were flat on her thighs, palms down, fingers spread, the posture of someone grounding themselves after a shock. 3 separate traps on a single route. Caleb did not turn around. Layered, each one designed to catch what the previous one missed. Garrett shook his head slowly. The windshield wipers swept back and forth, clearing rain that was finally beginning to lighten, and through the cleared glass, the highway stretched ahead in a long, straight line that disappeared into the gray distance of a night that was slowly giving way to something less dark. Whoever planned this had the route, the schedule, the vehicle specs, and enough time to prep 3 different kill points along a 20-mile stretch of highway. Garrett's voice was flat, the tone of a man building a case from evidence rather than speculation. That's not hired muscle, that's institutional access. Diana's voice came from the bush seat with a quality that Caleb had not heard from her before. Not cold, not sharp, tired. The bone-deep fatigue of a person who has spent years building something and has just discovered that the threat to it is not external but internal, growing in the walls, like raw, invisible until the structure begins to fail. The route was filed through the Executive Operations Office 2 days ago. 3 people have access to that system outside of Garrett's team. Russell Pryor is one of them. Who are the other 2? Caleb asked. My executive assistant, who has been with me for 11 years and who I trust with my life. And the third, the fleet operations manager. He reports to Pryor. Garrett and Caleb reached the same conclusion at the same time, which was itself a measure of how far the relationship between them had traveled in the space of an hour. Two men who had started the evening as adversaries on a rain-soaked shoulder were now thinking in parallel. And the thought they shared was this: the fleet operations manager reported to Pryor. Pryor had access to the route. The fleet manager had access to the vehicles. Between them, they had everything necessary to plan and execute exactly what had happened tonight. But the execution itself, the hands under the vehicle, the blade on the sidewall, the insert placed with surgical precision that required a third element. A pair of hands that knew this specific kind of work. Not a manager's hands, a mechanic's hands. The convoy rolled south. The rain eased to a mist. The first faint suggestion of dawn appeared at the eastern edge of the sky, a thin line of gray lighter than the gray around it, the promise of a morning that was still an hour away. But that was coming regardless of whether the people on this highway were ready for it. Caleb thought about the tattoo on the driver's wrist. A wrench, the mark of a man who identified himself by his tools. Caleb understood that identification in a way that was uncomfortably intimate because he carried the same marks on his hands, the same calluses, the same muscle memory, the same fluency in the language of metal and rubber, and hydraulic pressure. The man at the intersection was a mirror, and the reflection showed Caleb what he might have become if the choices had gone differently, if Jenny had not gotten sick, if Sophie had not been born, if the reasons to stay straight had not outweighed the reasons to drift. The difference between him and the man with the tattoo was not skill, it was selection. What you chose to do with hands that could fix or destroy with equal proficiency. Garrett spoke into the radio. All vehicles report status. 4 acknowledgments came back clean. No damage, no casualties, no pursuit. Garrett looked at Caleb. The security chief's face was drawn, the tension of the night etched in lines that would take more than a night's sleep to erase. But there was something else in his expression, now something that had been absent at the beginning of the evening, when the chief of security had looked at the roadside mechanic and seen a threat to be managed rather than a resource to be utilized. Respect was too simple a word. Garrett had worked with professionals his entire career. Secret Service agents, military liaisons, corporate security specialists with advanced degrees and government clearances. The man sitting next to him had none of those credentials, and all of the competence and the dissonance between the two was something Garrett was still working to reconcile. You ever get tired of being the smartest person in rooms where nobody expects you to be? Garrett asked, and the question carried no sarcasm, only the genuine curiosity of a man who recognized a peer in an unlikely package. Caleb watched the road. The mist was lifting. The sky was marginally lighter. Somewhere behind them, 3 failed traps marked the route they had survived, and somewhere ahead, the city of Richmond was waking up to a morning that did not know what had happened on its highways overnight. The rooms don't matter, Caleb said quietly. What matters is the work. The convoy continued south. The damaged SUV rolled steadily on its temporary repair, the clamp holding the pressure stable, the mechanical judgment of a man who had spent his life trusting his hands, proving once again that the simplest solutions applied precisely could hold against forces that more expensive and complicated systems had failed to anticipate. And in the back seat, Diana Ashford watched the quiet mechanic through the gap between the headrest and the window, and she carried with her the growing awareness that the most significant encounter of her evening, perhaps of her year, perhaps of the carefully constructed and fiercely defended life she had built from nothing, was with a man who wanted nothing from her except to finish the job and go home to his daughter. That awareness sat in her chest in a space she had not known was empty until something began to fill it. The city materialized through the mist the way cities do at dawn. Not all at once, but in layers first, the highway signs with their green reflective faces catching the convoy headlights. Then the overpass structures spanning the road like concrete ribs. Then the first scatter of commercial buildings with their parking lots empty and their security lights burning the flat orange of sodium vapor. Richmond was waking up. The clock on the dashboard read 5:41, and the night that had started with a flat tire on a dark road was finally releasing its grip on the people who had survived it. Garrett guided the SUV through the southern checkpoint, where two police cruisers waited with their light bars cycling blue and white against the gray morning. The officers straightened when the convoy approached the posture of professionals who had been briefed on who was coming and why. Garrett rolled down the window and exchanged words that Caleb did not fully hear. Something about escort protocol in a secure destination, and then the cruisers pulled into position ahead of the convoy, and the whole formation moved together into the city like a single organism. Diana had made the call to police while Caleb and Garrett navigated the diesel slick, using the 4 minutes of relative calm before the intersection to contact her legal counsel in the Richmond PD simultaneously. She had delivered the facts without embellishment or emotion: the sabotage vehicle, the layered traps, the circumstantial connection to her CFO, the board vote scheduled for 9 the following morning. The efficiency of the calls reminded Caleb of field communications he had heard in another life: compressed information delivered under pressure by people trained to separate what mattered from what did not. Diana Ashford had not built a defense contracting empire by panicking, and she was not going to start tonight. The Ashford Defense Systems headquarters rose at the end of a wide boulevard lined with the mature oaks that had dropped their leaves for winter, their bare branches reaching across the road like interlocking fingers. The building itself was glass and steel, 12 stories of corporate architecture designed to project permanence and capability. Security gates flanked the private entrance, and a team of building security officers stood in formation near the lobby doors, their breath visible in the early morning cold. The convoy rolled to a stop. Garrett killed the engine. The silence inside the SUV was sudden and absolute after hours of road noise and radio chatter and the constant percussion of rain on metal. For a moment, nobody moved. The three of them sat in the stillness of a vehicle that should have been a wreck on a guardrail, and instead was parked in front of a building worth more than most of the homes in the county Caleb had been working in 12 hours ago. Diana stepped out first. Building security moved toward her immediately, the choreographed approach of people who had rehearsed this arrival without knowing the circumstances that would precede it. Garrett followed, rolling his shoulders as he stood working out the tension that hours of white-knuckle driving had deposited in muscles that were too old to absorb that kind of sustained stress without complaint. Caleb climbed out last. He reached into the back seat for his tool bag, the canvas worn soft with years, the zipper track stained dark with a decade of accumulated grease, and slung it over his shoulder. The weight of it was familiar and grounding, an anchor to the world he actually occupied. He stood on the polished concrete of the Ashford Defense entrance and looked up at the glass facade reflecting the first pink edge of sunrise, and he felt the distance between this place and his kitchen table the way an astronaut might feel the distance between a space station and the ground. Same planet, different atmosphere. Garrett caught his eye across the roof of the SUV. The security chief looked like a man who had been through a war and was only now permitting himself to acknowledge it. 12 hours ago, this had been a routine executive transport on a Tuesday evening. Now it was a crime scene, an attempted murder investigation, and the worst professional failure of Garrett Cole's career. He had missed everything: the scoring, the insert, the brake line, the diesel, the funnel. Every layer of a meticulously planned assassination had passed through his security perimeter without triggering a single alarm, and the only reason his principal was alive was a mechanic who had stopped to change a tire because his conscience would not let him drive past. Garrett walked around the vehicle and stopped in front of Caleb. The two men stood facing each other in the cold dawn, the glass tower behind them, the battered convoy around them, the remnants of a night that had rearranged both their understandings of who could be relied upon and who could not. "You know," Garrett started, and his voice carried the rough edge of someone whose throat was tired from hours of radio commands and controlled breathing. Tonight was supposed to be the easy shift. Caleb adjusted the tool bag on his shoulder. They never are. Garrett almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that men in their 50s exchanged when words were insufficient and humor was the only bridge between what had happened and what they were willing to say about it. Come inside, Garrett continued. We need to brief the team, and you're the one who found everything. Caleb followed him through the lobby and into an elevator that carried them to the 8th floor where a conference room with glass walls overlooked the boulevard below. The room was already occupied. Two police detectives in plain clothes sat at one end of the table, laptops open, a uniformed officer standing near the door with the patient posture of someone expecting a long morning. A woman Caleb did not recognize was arranging documents on the table, Diana's legal counsel, presumably given the intensity of her focus and the thickness of the file she was organizing. Caleb set his tool bag against the wall and took a seat at the far end of the table, positioning himself at the periphery the way a man accustomed to being a guest in other people's worlds habitually did. The chair was leather, the table was polished walnut, the overhead lights were recessed and warm. Everything in this room was designed to make the people sitting in it feel important, and Caleb felt the opposite, not unimportant, but misplaced, a socket wrench in a drawer full of fountain pens. The briefing moved quickly. Garrett outlined the events of the evening in chronological order, starting with Diana's departure from the office and ending with the convoy's arrival at the building. He was precise and clinical. A former federal agent delivering testimony, and his account matched what Caleb had observed, with one addition that Caleb had not known. Garrett's team had been running a parallel route standard protocol for executive transport, but a traffic incident on the interstate had delayed their rendezvous by 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which Diana's vehicle was alone on Route 301. 11 minutes during which the fuel station stop became the window of vulnerability. The detectives asked questions. Caleb answered the ones directed at him with the same economy he applied to mechanical work. No wasted motion, no unnecessary detail. He described the scoring on the sidewall, the wipe section of brake line, the spike insert, the diesel on the curve, the funnel at the intersection. He described them in the language of a man who understood cause and effect at the molecular level of metal fatigue and hydraulic pressure. And the detectives listened with the particular attentiveness of people who recognized expertise that exceeded their own in a specific domain. Then the secondary camera footage from the fuel station arrived on one of the detectives' laptops, forwarded by the station owner, who had been contacted an hour earlier. The footage was grainy, shot from a camera mounted high on the building's east wall at an angle that captured the parking area in wide-angle distortion. But it was sufficient. A white cargo van parked in the lot for 14 minutes, positioned away from the primary cameras, but visible from this secondary angle. A figure exiting the passenger side, moving directly to Diana's SUV, disappearing beneath the right rear quarter panel. 4 minutes of activity, return to the van, departure. The figure's face was not visible, but his hands were. And on the right wrist, caught in a frame where the parking lot light hit at precisely the correct angle, was a tattoo. A wrench. Caleb leaned forward. The image was blurry, pixelated, degraded by compression and angle and distance. But the tattoo was unmistakable, the same mark he had seen at the intersection when the convoy headlights swept across the blocking vehicle. Same wrist, same design, same man. Garrett saw Caleb's recognition. You've seen that before. The driver at the intersection, same tattoo, same wrist. Garrett turned to the detectives. Can you enhance the image enough for facial recognition? The detective worked the laptop for several minutes, isolating frames, adjusting contrast. The face remained obscured, but a partial profile emerged in one frame where the figure glanced toward the station building. Garrett stared at it, then his expression underwent the kind of transformation that happened when professional knowledge and personal memory collided. I know him. Garrett's voice was flat with the particular anger of a man who had been betrayed by proximity. Tommy Barrett. He was a fleet technician here, specialized in the executive vehicle program. Maintained the armored SUVs, knew every line and component. A breath. Pryor signed his termination 2 years ago. A violation of safety protocols. Diana had entered the room during the footage review, standing near the glass wall with her arms crossed watching the screen. At the mention of Barrett's name, something shifted in her posture, a settling the way a structure settled when the last piece of weight was placed and the load path became clear. Pryor fired him, she said. Not a question. Garrett nodded. And then Pryor hired him back, off the books, to do this. The logic was complete. Pryor had the motive the board vote that would end his career and expose his theft. Pryor had the access, the route filed through the executive operations system, the fleet specifications, the schedule. Barrett had the skill, 2 years of hands-on experience with the exact vehicles in the Ashford fleet, intimate knowledge of brake line routing and suspension geometry, the mechanical expertise to execute a 3-stage sabotage plan in 4 minutes in a gas station parking lot. The CFO had provided the blueprint. The former technician had provided the hands. And a man who fixed cars for a living, a man who was not part of any plan or any organization or any system, had dismantled the entire operation by stopping to help a stranger. Caleb looked at the image of Barrett on the screen. The partial profile showed a man not much younger than himself, with the weathered features of someone who worked outdoors and the lean build of someone who spent more time under vehicles than behind desks. A mechanic. The word carried a specific gravity for Caleb that it did not carry for anyone else in the room. Barrett was a mechanic. Caleb was a mechanic. They shared a language, a skill set, an understanding of how things were built and how they could be broken. The difference was not in the knowledge, but in the application, not in the hands, but in the choices those hands made. Barrett had chosen money from a man who had discarded him. Caleb had chosen a kitchen table and a 9-year-old girl who watched clocks. The gap between those choices was narrow enough to see across and wide enough to define a life. Diana stepped away from the glass wall and addressed the room. Before we proceed with the investigation, there's something Russell Pryor should hear directly. Garrett frowned. Ma'am, I'd advise against any contact before the arrest. Diana's expression was the one Caleb had seen on the highway, the expression of a woman who had built an empire by making decisions other people advised against. He already knows the plan failed. He saw the convoy arrive on whatever surveillance he's running. If I don't call him, he runs. If I call him, he freezes for the 10 minutes it takes Henrico PD to reach his door. Garrett considered this. Then he nodded. Diana dialed from the conference room speakerphone. The ringtone filled the glass-walled room 3 times before Russell Pryor answered. His voice was smooth, practiced the voice of a man who had spent decades disguising intention behind pleasantry. Diana, I heard there was some kind of incident on your drive tonight. Are you all right? The room went still. The detective stopped typing. Garrett's hand rested on the table motionless. Caleb watched Diana's face, and what he saw there was not anger or fear, but something colder and more precise. The controlled focus of a person who understood that this conversation was not about information, but about time. Diana's voice was steady, each word placed with the deliberation of someone setting stones in a wall. I'm fine, Russell. The board meeting is still on schedule for 9 this morning. I'll see you there. 3 seconds of silence followed. 3 seconds during which the speakerphone transmitted nothing but the faint hiss of an open line and the ambient sound of wherever Russell Pryor was standing, which was almost certainly not his home, because a man who had ordered the murder of his CEO did not sit in his living room waiting for the news to arrive. The silence said everything his words would not. It was the silence of a man recalculating, of a chess player, watching the board rearrange itself into a configuration he had not anticipated. Then the line went dead. Garrett looked at Diana. He'll run. Diana nodded, which is why I called Henrico PD before I called him. The detectives exchanged a glance. One of them reached for his phone. The machinery of law enforcement, which had been turning slowly in the background all night, engaged a higher gear. 40 minutes later, the detective's phone rang. He answered, listened, and his eyebrows rose. He put the phone down and addressed the room. Russell Pryor was intercepted attempting to board a private aircraft at Chesterfield County Airport. He's in custody. Diana received the news with a single nod. Garrett exhaled. The detectives exchanged a glance that communicated professional satisfaction with the kind of restraint that law enforcement cultivated over years of practice. And Barrett, Diana asked, a PB issued. Last known location based on the intersection sighting puts him heading south on Route 10. Motel canvass is underway. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, covering evidence chain procedures, Diana's statement schedule, and the logistics of the board meeting that remained on calendar for 9 that morning. Caleb listened without contributing because the mechanical portion of the evening was over, and what remained was legal architecture that did not require his tools or his expertise. He sat in the leather chair at the periphery of the walnut table and felt the exhaustion arrive in full, the adrenaline that had sustained him for 6 hours finally converting into something heavy and slow that settled into his bones and his eyelids and the muscles of his forearms that had been gripping tools and steering wheels since the previous afternoon. The room began to empty. The detectives packed their laptops. The legal counsel gathered her files. The uniformed officer opened the door. Garrett stepped into the hallway to coordinate with building security, and for a moment Caleb and Diana were alone in the glass conference room, with the sunrise painting the boulevard outside in shades of gold and pink that belonged to a different kind of story than the one they had just lived through. Diana walked to the window. The light caught her face from the side, emphasizing the architecture of fatigue that the night had built the shadows beneath her eyes, the slight tightness at the corners of her mouth, the general diminishment that sleeplessness imposed on even the most disciplined faces. She was 45 years old, CEO of a company she had built from the ground floor, survivor of a marriage that had ended in betrayal, leader of an organization that employed people who tried to kill her. Standing in the morning light, she looked like a woman who had been strong for so long that strength had become indistinguishable from loneliness. I run 1,000 employees, she said, and her voice was quieter than he had heard it all night, stripped of the authority and the sharpness and the corporate cadence that had characterized every word since the roadside. I design systems that protect military convoys and government networks. And tonight, the thing that saved my life was a man with a $40 clamp who stopped because he saw someone standing in the rain. Caleb did not respond immediately. He was looking at the city below the early morning traffic beginning to populate the boulevard. The headlights of commuters heading to jobs that would require them to sit in chairs like this one and make decisions about things that mattered less than brake lines and lug nuts. The world that Diana inhabited, the world of glass towers and board votes and security details, was visible from this window in every direction. His own world, the world of gravel shoulders and worn tool bags and promises to a 9-year-old, was 22 miles northwest and waiting. People look at problems from where they stand, he said finally. You stand up here, you see strategy systems threats. I spend my life under things, under hoods, under dashboards, under chassis. I see what's broken because I'm already at the level where things break. Diana turned from the window. The sunrise behind her created a silhouette that softened the corporate edges and revealed the outline of a person rather than a position. You don't look at things the way anyone I know looks at them. That's because everyone you know wants something from you. The observation landed in the space between them with the gentle force of something that was true and that both of them recognized as true, and that neither of them was prepared to fully examine in the exhausted aftermath of a night that had nearly ended differently. Diana held his gaze for a moment that lasted longer than professional courtesy required, and shorter than either of them might have wanted if circumstances were different, and if both of them were not the kind of people who guarded their interior lives the way other people guarded their wallets. "And what do you want?" she asked. Caleb looked at the sunrise. To go home to my daughter, eat breakfast, maybe sleep for a few hours. Diana smiled, and the smile was not the one she used in boardrooms or press conferences or the carefully curated photographs on the company website. It was smaller and less symmetrical and infinitely more real. The kind of smile that slipped through the defenses of a person who had spent years making sure her smile served strategic purposes. This one served nothing. It just happened. I envy you that, she said, and the admission cost her something that Caleb could hear in the slight roughness of her voice, the sound of a wall developing a crack. Having someone to go home to. The moment held. Then it released, not because either of them wanted it to end, but because both of them understood that mornings after near-death experiences were not the foundation on which meaningful connections were built. They were the cracks through which the possibility of connection could be glimpsed. And glimpsing was enough for now, Garrett returned. Diana straightened the CEO, reassembling over the person who had briefly surfaced. She reached into the pocket of her coat, which had dried during the briefing, into a stiff approximation of its original shape and produced a business card. She held it out to Caleb. My direct line. If you change your mind about anything. Caleb took the card. It was heavy stock, embossed, the kind of card that cost more per unit than he charged per hour for brake work. He turned it over in his calloused fingers and slid it into the pocket of his canvas jacket, where it settled against the fabric beside a receipt from the auto parts store and a crayon drawing Sophie had given him 3 days ago that he carried because throwing away his daughter's art was not something he was capable of doing. Garrett stepped forward. We could use someone who sees what you see. The offer's real. Caleb shook his hand. I know it is, but my daughter already thinks I work too much. Garrett nodded slowly, the nod of a man who understood that some decisions were not about capability or opportunity, but about a hierarchy of obligations that a father carried and that no salary could rearrange. When we call, Garrett said, and the when was deliberate, not if pick up. Caleb shouldered his tool bag and walked toward the elevator. The hallway was quiet, the building still mostly empty at this hour, the fluorescent lights humming the low-frequency hum of corporate infrastructure operating in the absence of the people it was designed to serve. His boots left faint prints on the polished floor, traces of mud and gravel from the highway's shoulder temporary marks that the cleaning crew would erase by 9 before the board meeting. Before the vote, before the world Diana Ashford had built began the process of repairing the damage that Russell Pryor had tried to inflict. He reached the lobby. The security guards at the entrance watched him pass with expressions that combined curiosity, awe, and deference in equal measure, because word had traveled through the building's informal communication network at the speed of rumor, which was faster than light and considerably less accurate. They knew a mechanic had done something important. They did not know the details. They saw the tool bag and the stained jacket and the boots, and they filed the image in the same mental category where they kept other things that did not fit their usual framework. Anomalies, exceptions. The kind of people who appeared in crises and disappeared afterward, leaving behind only the consequences of their presence. The morning air hit him as he walked through the automatic doors, cool and clean. The rain finally gone, the sky brightening from gray to pale blue in the east. His truck was not here. It was still on the highway's shoulder 20 miles north, sitting where he had left it with the tools scattered in the bed and the passenger door that required a specific sequence to open. He would need to get it towed, or maybe Garrett would send someone. That was a problem for later. Right now, a police cruiser was idling at the curb and the officer inside gestured through the window. Mr. Mercer, we're giving you a ride home. Chief Cole's orders. Caleb climbed into the back of the cruiser. The seat was hard plastic designed for a different kind of passenger than the one currently occupying it, and the irony of a man who had just prevented an assassination riding home in the back of a police car was not lost on him. He leaned his head against the window and watched the city slide past as the cruiser headed north through downtown, past the commercial districts, through the suburbs, where the houses got smaller and the yards got bigger, and the trees changed from ornamental plantings to the hardwoods that had been there before the city existed. The drive took 22 minutes. He counted them the way Sophie counted them, each one a unit of distance between where he was and where he belonged. The cruiser turned onto a street at 6:14 in the morning. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that lived in working-class streets at dawn, before the school buses and the commuter traffic and the sound of lawnmowers and barking dogs filled the air with the evidence of ordinary lives being ordinarily lived. His house sat at the end of the block, a Cape Cod with white siding that needed painting, and a front porch that needed the railing replaced, in a yard that needed mowing but would not get mowed until Saturday, because Saturday was the only day he did not work. The porch light was on. The small yellow bulb mounted beside the front door, the one Sophie turned on when he was late, the one she refused to turn off until he was home, the one that had burned through more replacement bulbs than any other fixture in the house, because it operated on the schedule of a child's worry rather than the schedule of an electrical timer. It was on now at 6:14 in the morning, which meant Sophie had left it burning all night, which meant she had been worried all night, which meant the stone that had been sitting in Caleb's chest since the first phone call was now approximately the size of his fist. He thanked the officer, climbed out of the cruiser, and stood on the sidewalk as it pulled away. The street was still. A mockingbird sang from the oak tree in the neighbor's yard, running through its catalog of borrowed songs in the way mockingbirds did, trying every voice until something answered. The air smelled like wet grass, and the last trace of rain and the sunrise had reached the roof line of the house, painting the white siding in warm gold that made the peeling paint look almost intentional, like distressing on expensive furniture. The front door opened before he reached the porch steps. Sophie came out in her oversized hoodie and mismatched socks, hair tangled from a night of restless sleep, moving with the specific urgency of a child who had been waiting for a sound and had finally heard it. She crossed the yard at a speed that suggested the ground between the porch and the sidewalk was an obstacle rather than a distance, and she hit him at approximately the waist, her arms wrapping around him with the fierce compression of someone who had spent the night converting fear into grip strength. "You're late." Her voice was muffled against his jacket, which smelled like rain and grease and brake fluid and the leather interior of a vehicle that cost more than their house. He wrapped his arms around her and held on. "Yeah, longer night than I expected." She leaned back and looked out at him with the evaluative precision that children reserved for the moments when adults were not telling the whole truth and children knew it. "You look tired." "Fixing cars all night will do that." "You always say that." He brushed her hair back from her forehead with fingers that still had grease in the creases of the knuckles, gentle, despite the roughness, the way hands that spent their days on metal learned to be gentle on skin. "Because it's usually true." Sophie looked past him toward the street where the cruiser had departed. "Was that a police car?" "They gave me a ride, truck's getting towed." She absorbed this with the adaptability of a child who had learned early that her father's life involved complications that other fathers' lives did not. She did not ask why the truck needed towing. She did not ask why a police car had delivered him. She took the information and filed it in the place where she kept all the things about her father that she did not fully understand but accepted, because accepting was what you did when someone was yours and you were theirs. They walked into the house together. The kitchen smelled like the ghost of last night's mac and cheese, and this morning's coffee, which Mrs. Adler must have set on a timer before she left. A note on the table in the neighbor's careful handwriting. She stayed up until 11. "Everything is fine. Call if you need anything." The word "fine" was underlined twice, which in Mrs. Adler's vocabulary meant the opposite of fine but manageable. Caleb set the note aside and poured coffee. The machine gurgled the last of the pot into his mug, and the warmth of the ceramic against his palms was the first physical comfort he had experienced in 8 hours. He sat at the kitchen table in the chair that had been his since they bought the set at a consignment shop the year Sophie was born, and the familiarity of the seat, the angle of the light through the window, the sound of Sophie climbing into her own chair across from him, These things accumulated into something that was not quite peace, but was the closest approximation available to a man who had spent the night dismantling a three-stage assassination on the side of a Virginia highway. Sophie watched him over the rim of her orange juice glass, which she held with both hands in the way that small people held large containers with concentration and care. You saved somebody again, didn't you? Caleb paused with the coffee mug halfway to his mouth. What makes you think that? She shrugged, the shrug of a 9-year-old who had figured something out and was not particularly impressed with her own deduction, because to her it was obvious. You always look like that when you help people. Like what? Like you're pretending it wasn't a big deal. He set the mug down and looked at his daughter, at the tangled hair and the sleep-creased face and the eyes that saw through him with the effortless transparency that children wielded before the world taught them to be fooled by the surfaces adults constructed. She was 9 years old. She could not change a tire or identify a scored sidewall or clamp a severed brake line. But she could read her father the way her father read engines, by the sounds they made when something was off. And right now she was telling him that his sounds were off and she had noticed. He slid a plate of toast across the table. You're too smart for your own good. She grinned. The grin was Jenny's, the same asymmetry, the same flash of mischief, the same genetic echo that caught him off guard every time, because the dead did not leave cleanly, they left traces in the faces of the living. He watched her eat, and he drank his coffee in the kitchen filled with the particular silence that existed between people who loved each other and did not need to perform that love for it to be present. Outside the window, the street was fully awake now. A school bus passed at the far end of the block, its yellow hull bright against the new morning. The neighbor across the street retrieved his newspaper from the lawn. 2 houses down, a dog barked at a squirrel with the conviction that this time, the outcome would be different. The ordinary world was operating at full capacity, indifferent to the extraordinary events that had occurred on a highway 20 miles south, and that indifference was itself a kind of comfort, the assurance that the world continued regardless of what happened to the people moving through it. Sophie finished her toast and put her plate in the sink with the careful precision of a child following house rules she had internalized. Dad, yeah, are we going to be okay with insurance this month? The question hit him in a place that was already bruised. 9 years old and asking about insurance premiums. 9 years old and carrying the weight of adult arithmetic because she lived in a house where the math was visible, where her father's worry was an ambient condition she had adapted to the way fish adapted to water by not noticing it until the level changed. His hand found the business card in his jacket pocket. The embossed lettering pressed against his fingertips through the fabric, the raised outline of a name and a number, and an offer that could change the arithmetic permanently. Diana Ashford's direct line. A job that would use every skill he had buried. A salary that would make insurance premiums and mortgage payments and auto parts receipts feel like rounding errors rather than existential threats. He looked at Sophie. You worry about your stuff. That's my job. She nodded, total trust. The faith that children placed in their parents, despite all evidence that parents were fallible mortal, frequently wrong and occasionally late for dinner. She trusted him because he was her father, and because every time the world had tested him in front of her, he had not buckled. He had bent. He had strained. He had driven home at dawn smelling like someone else's emergency, but he had not buckled. He stood up and carried his mug to the sink. The water was warm. The dish soap smelled like synthetic lemon, the store brand kind that cost $1.49. He washed the mug and Sophie's plate and the orange juice glass, and while his hands worked through the familiar routine of soap and water and ceramic, his phone vibrated on the counter. A text message from Garrett Cole Pryor in custody at Chesterfield County. Barrett picked up at a motel on Route 9 6:30 this morning. Both charged. Evidence from your assessment cited in the warrant. Thank you. GC. Caleb read it once. Then a second message arrived from a different number. The typing was different, more deliberate, the punctuation of someone who composed messages. with the same care she composed contracts. Board vote completed at 9:15. Unanimous. If you ever change your mind about that offer, I know a coffee shop considerably better than your kitchen. DA. He stared at the message. The morning light fell across the phone screen, making the words glow faintly. Behind him, Sophie was humming something at the table, a song from a cartoon she watched on Saturday mornings, a melody that had no connection to anything that had happened in the last 12 hours, and that was perfect for exactly that reason. The humming was the sound of normalcy of a child who did not know that her father had spent the night navigating a conspiracy and who believed with the unshakable conviction of the young that he had simply been fixing cars. Caleb did not reply to Diana's message, but he did not delete it. He set the phone down on the counter and picked up the dish towel and dried the mug and hung the towel on the oven handle the way he always did. In the routine of it, the deep familiarity of this kitchen and this morning and this child humming behind him settled over him like a coat that fit. The business card was still in his pocket. The message was still on his phone. The offer was still open. And for the first time in 3 years of grinding work and tight margins and promises he could not always keep, Caleb Mercer allowed himself to consider the possibility that the next chapter of his life might not look exactly like the last one. That the skills he had buried could have a purpose that did not require him to leave his daughter behind. That a door had opened on a rainy highway, and behind it was something he had not expected and was not prepared for and could not yet name. But the door was there, and he had not closed it. Sophie appeared beside him at the counter, holding her empty juice glass, looking up at him with the expression of a child who had inherited her mother's ability to see the truth beneath the surface and who wielded that inheritance without mercy or restraint. Dad, you're doing the thing again. What thing? The standing still and thinking thing. You do it when something big happened and you don't want to talk about it. He looked down at her, Jenny's eyes, Jenny's grin, his stubbornness, his hands already the way she gripped the glass with that specific combination of care and strength that meant she would probably be good with tools if she wanted to be, or good with anything else she chose because the grip was not about the object, but about the intention behind it. Something big happened, he admitted. Sophie nodded satisfied. I knew it. And she put the glass in the sink and walked back to the table with the unhurried confidence of someone who had confirmed a hypothesis and could now move on to other matters. Can I watch cartoons? Yeah. She disappeared into the living room. A moment later, the television produced the bright, chaotic sounds of animated characters navigating problems that could be resolved in 11-minute increments, a world where consequences were temporary, and every episode ended with the restoration of equilibrium. Caleb listened to it from the kitchen and felt the distance between that world and the one he occupied, and the distance was not sad. It was correct. She was 9. She deserved cartoon problems. The other kind could wait. He looked out the kitchen window. The street was quiet again, the school bus gone, the neighbor back inside the home, having apparently conceded the squirrel battle for the morning. The light was fully up, now yellow and warm, the kind of Virginia morning that followed a hard rain, and that felt, despite everything, like something starting rather than something ending. On the counter, his phone sat silently beside the dish soap. In his pocket, the business card pressed against his thigh. In the living room, Sophie laughed at something on the television, a bright, uncomplicated sound that filled the small house and reminded him why he had walked away from the last career and why he might eventually, carefully with the caution of a man who checked brake lines before he trusted them, walk toward the next one. The porch light was still on. He walked to the front door and switched it off. For the first time since the previous evening, no one in this house was waiting for anyone to come home. Everyone was here. The clock on the kitchen wall, the battery-operated one Jenny had bought at a yard sale, ticked steadily above the stove, and its rhythm was no longer a countdown. It was just time, moving forward, the way it was supposed to.